Hello and welcome to the first session of David Auerbach's From Leibniz to Google, 5 Paradigms of Artificial Intelligence. This course is an archaeological investigation into the shifting paradigms of artificial intelligence. AI has never been a well-defined term. We will look at where its practitioners have focused their efforts, how they have conceived of their field in relation to philosophical ideas of minds, machines, and computation, and how technological developments have exerted force on these conceptions. David is the author of Bitwise, A Life in Code. He's a writer, technologist, and software engineer who has worked at Google and Microsoft after graduating from Yale University. In addition to scholarship on James Joyce, William Shakespeare, and artificial intelligence, his writing has appeared in the Times Literary Supplement, MIT Technology Review, The Nation, N+1, Tablet, The Daily Beast, and Book Forum, among many other publications. He has lectured around the world on technology, literature, philosophy, and stupidity. He lives in New York City with his family and 5,000 books. David, please.
Hi, welcome to the course. This is built under the rubric of critical philosophy. So I want to start off by saying that artificial intelligence is the most philosophical area of computer science because it poses the vaguest questions and it also has the greatest history of failure. And those are probably two of the keenest markers of philosophy that there is. I built it. It is sort of interdisciplinary simply by nature, and I think that one of the things we'll talk about as we get on is just because of how disciplines have divided themselves up, a lot of what artificial intelligence does straddles different disciplines, but there's not really a lot of conversation between people who research those individual disciplines. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why this archaeology is, I think, useful and also turns up some very bizarre phenomena that I think are frequently ignored in talking about AI, because today it's become such a buzzword and it's so ubiquitous that it's surprising that there's no particularly well-defined or well-accepted definition of what constitutes artificial intelligence. So that is why I use the term archaeology, and I was drawn to that term by Foucault's use of it, and as well as the philosopher of science Ian Hacking, who took it and applied it to the history of mathematics. And what I mean by archaeology is we're going to take various texts from the history of artificial intelligence, and we're going to excavate them to uncover what they might tell us. And that's a bit distinct from the pure philosophy of artificial intelligence, because this method is very historically focused. And it's different from the history of AI because we're looking for conceptual underpinnings and the currents of thought that have gotten buried by the present story of what artificial intelligence is and how it came to be. And I think the result is that you'll see just how strange the entire notion of AI is and why this approach is particularly valuable for it. As an undergraduate in computer science at Yale, I learned it as a subfield of computer science, but it really does stand apart from every other subfield of computer science. The history we'll be looking at begins more or less in the 1940s, although the term artificial intelligence itself was not coined until 1955 or 1956 by John McCarthy when he was applying for a research grant at Dartmouth for a very important conference that sort of jump-started I think what we're going to call our second paradigm, the symbolic AI paradigm. And this sort of twisted knot of, okay, when did this field start? Who constituted it? Who was actually talking about it? And who was talking about something else? I think you have to look at AI as an embedded term, as much as something like gender studies or post-structuralism or critical theory is a term that's embedded in certain cultural contexts and practices. AI doesn't have the smooth quasi-universality of something like mathematics or geometry, or even to take it as a definition, the notion of history, which has a reasonably well accepted boundary, although, you know, in our day and age, people are always trying to blur the boundaries. But, you know, for a lot of reasons, people don't treat AI as a field that is that embedded in cultural contexts and shifting paradigms in quite the same way as these more humanistic or sociological disciplines. But and there's good reasons for that as well. But we will be looking at that issue extensively. I think part of the reason why it doesn't get treated with quite that level of historicity is what it owes to what physicist Eugene Wigner called the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics in the natural sciences, which is why is it that mathematics is so incredibly good at modeling natural and physical phenomena. And that goes for the computational sciences as well, because computers are built on mathematics and they are great at doing mathematics. So to the extent that you can frame real world problems as deterministic or at least probabilistic mathematical problems, you can solve them far faster with computers. And that goes for AI. To the extent that you can frame the problems of AI as mathematical problems, you can solve them very quickly. The trick for AI specifically has been to figure out what the problems are and how you're going to frame them mathematically and symbolically, and that is it's a huge difficulty. But because AI has the sheen around it of mathematics and computers, it doesn't quite look humanistic in the way that the humanities or the social sciences or even biology does. And there is this pervasive bias that once you've gotten rid of the human element, you know, because AI constantly points out and reminds you just how non-human it is. Once you've gotten rid of that human element, you're tempted to think you're in some objective realm where culture and history don't matter as much. Now, you know, we all know that's not true, but that bias is incredibly insidious. You know, even the most relativistic postmodernists in the world have it. And when I talk about these cultural contexts, I'm not even talking about, you know, the programs itself or the act of programming, because we can say, well, a programmer injects their bias into a program, et cetera, et cetera. Yes, but I'm also talking a step back in terms of the construction of the very idea of artificial intelligence. So, you know, programs have bias, but people frequently, you know, there's still, I think, a prevailing received idea that the background against which the action of programming and even research happens is somehow more pure and ahistorical than the background against which the scholarship itself happens. That the definitional terminology of AI is a bit more fixed than it actually is. So to combat that tendency, I frame this course as looking at a series of theoretical paradigms in artificial intelligence. And I divide it up into four loose ones, and and the names of them I've given as first, cybernetics, second, symbolic AI, which also can be known as GOFAI, GOFI, or good old-fashioned AI, which was a paradigm that I think dominated in the 50s and 60s to almost possibly the exclusion of almost else. The subsequent paradigm of the 80s and 90s, which I'm calling connectionism, but can also be called parallel distributed processing, sub-symbolic AI. It encompasses things like neural networks, evolutionary computing, and things that take their inspiration from mathematical models of either biological phenomena or an attempt to learn, to have a machine learn in a non-symbolic way. And we'll get back to all of this. I'm just trying to frame this in ways that so that if I refer to symbolic AI or connectionism or cybernetics, you'll know that that's one of the paradigms. And the final paradigm is the one we have today, deep learning. And that's the one that sort of really broke through into the public consciousness because Google and Facebook used it. I think that's probably the main reason. And so these four paradigms, they're loose terms, but if you keep in mind that these are four broad periods, broadly sequential, and each one mostly really does displace the last, I think that's a fair count. I've split the reading into 7 topics that are more or less chronological. We're not necessarily going to be doing one a week. If something catches our eye and we really need more time to explore it, we'll spend an extra week on it. So the syllabus isn't necessarily linked up tightly to being on a fixed schedule, and so I'll let you know at each class or shortly after each class what reading would be best to do for the next class. So I wanted to start off with introductions, if that's okay by Ernan. The organizers said to expect a mix of experience, and based on what you've sent me, thank you for all of that. That seems to be what we've got. I'm not going to assume a great level of technical background, but at the same time, I'm not treating this as an introductory course either. So if you need background, hopefully we can get some of that offline. And if the pacing or you feel lost, shoot me an email after the session or after any subsequent class, and we'll figure something else out. So I'll go first. Ernan introduced me. I just wanted to give a little more informal background. I've sort of been all over the place. I was a computer geek as a kid growing up in the 80s. I programmed from a very young age because I thought that these computers were amazing things, and they made so much more sense than people did, and who, and so great. And with just a couple lines of code, you can get it to amazing things. But I also came to love literature, and part of that was because I think one of the reasons I'm ending up teaching this course is that I had this very nagging sense that computers were very far off from the human, and that there was this huge gap that hadn't been crossed. And it's been bizarre to see that in my lifetime, people have been trying very hard to get that gap to close with very mixed and perverse results. So I worked for many years as a software engineer at Microsoft and then at Google. And I did some graduate work during the time in literature and philosophy. And when I finally left software engineering, I fell into writing of various sorts. You can, if you're curious, my website, which is my name except with a dot before the CH. It's in Switzerland. It's the Swiss domain name registrar. So davidauerbach.ch. You can see some of the stuff that I've written over the years. Most recently, I wrote this book, which talks a bit about my own background in the context of computer science. It originally was going to be a nonfiction book. It ended up as sort of a memoir. And I think it worked out okay. And I've still been sort of being peripatetic. And this year I was working on criticism of using machine learning methods to analyze anonymous Renaissance plays to see if they were written by Shakespeare. I sort of fell into that. So yeah, so I guess I'm interdisciplinary myself, and I think that is in many ways, in our age of specialization, there's a lot to be gained from that. So I'd like to move on. Can we go around and do introductions, Ernan? Is that possible?
Of course, yeah.
Okay, great. If everybody could just say, you sent out the introductions to me. Thank you for that. If you want to say, just introduce yourself to the class, give a bit of an idea of your background, and just, I guess, Actually, why don't we do this now? Say, and give your answer to the question, what is artificial intelligence? And I'll take notes on some of these so I can call back to them later if it's useful.
Great. Who wants to go first?
I will happily do it. That's okay.
Okay. If you could say your name, that would be great.
My
Okay.
name is Ekin Arakan. My background in this topic of sorts, I was an undergraduate analytic philosophy major, and then I studied at Columbia my master's in film and media studies, more towards comparative media. Yeah, I mean, my recent research, as I'm applying to PhD programs and such, has been Giuseppe Longo's use of continuous computation, which is poised against Turing's discrete state machines. The question of characterizing AI is a bit tricky. If it were characterizing AGI or, something more human level like, it would be quite easier. But of course, this is not the question. The question is AI. So I will give the answer of something that through recursion and contingency is able to imitate patterning predictively and thus asymptotically reach towards something sentient or the appearance of something sentient.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you. There's a lot there that we'll be speaking to. All right. Who's next? Eric? Maybe I'll just call on people. Eric, would you like to go next?
Yeah.
I'm just going to go by who's popping up on my.
Everything's fine. Random order. Yes, I'm Eric Meyer. I live in Germany and I'm studying in Bielefeld. I'm still in my bachelor's, studying sociology and philosophy. And I have really no background whatsoever in computation, computer science, or anything like that. Maybe like a tiny bit about technology in the framework of sociology and philosophy, but really just a tiny bit. And I'm here to learn more about this. This whole topic of AI as I experienced. Okay, it becomes more and more important in philosophy and sociology, and I experience a lot of people who are just ignorant of it, and I just don't want to be like that. And yes, regarding the definition of AI, what I think AI is, I must confess I'm not at the level of knowledge that I can really answer this question without being like totally arbitrary.
That's perfectly fine. That's better.
Yeah,
arbitrary is better.
So I should give an arbitrary anser rather.
Yes, I think beginner's mind is good here. I think.
Okay. So maybe the question that I think should be answered is maybe if something like self-consciousness is like being conscious of having consciousness is a necessary condition for speaking of intelligence. Maybe, and I cannot answer this, but as a question we can pose towards, okay, what is it that makes AI or AGI?
That's great. That is great as well. I actually, my hope was to get people with wildly different answers precisely so that we can, I think, start to interrogate some of like what is this weird thing we call AI. Okay, thank you for that. Yeah,
okay.
It's great if you also say where you happen to be as well. Just
yeah.
Okay, thanks, Eric. Aladdin?
Yeah. Can you hear me well?
It's Aladdin?
Yeah, it's Aladdin.
Okay, great. Would you like to go next?
Sure. Yeah. So my name is Aladdin Borioli. I'm from Switzerland right now. I'm in the UK. for the weekend. I have a background in photography and visual anthropology, and I do my own research about the interspecies relationship between humans and bees using the field of art and anthropology. And I also don't have really a real background about AI or computer science, but my work got recently more closer to this, to computer science. So I thought the need to take the class. And to answer the question, it will be also highly arbitrary, but maybe what could be interesting is like, yeah, AI as a new form of intelligence that we never encountered before, and maybe that could help us a lot to understand the concept of intelligence itself, and especially when it comes to non-humans, and that humans have a lot of difficulty to apply intelligence to other beings.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Brian? I think you are muted.
Hi, my name is Brian. I live in Detroit, Michigan, United States, and I don't have much of a background in computer science. I got a bachelor's degree in philosophy a number of years ago, and I've been with the New Center since it started, taking classes and kind of just doing my own research. I've got a bunch of theories of intelligence that I want to see how it relates to the current work in AI. And yeah, I don't really know. I feel like I get too picky about what I would want to, say what artificial intelligence is. Off the top of my head, I'm thinking like one way to think about it might be an extrinsically coordinated system that's sort of reaching for autonomy or reaching for intrinsic coordination, or having values without having values. But I don't know. I can't. I don't feel like I can give a representative answer of what I think AI is right now. So, thanks.
Autonomy is a very interesting concept as well. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Geronimo?
Yeah, you can hear me now?
I can hear you. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm originally from Mexico City. At the moment, I'm based in Texas, where I'm going through an MFA program. And my background is on graphic design. I had a graphic design studio for like 8 years. And at the same time, I was working as an electronic music producer. So like 2 years ago, I decided to switch to art. And at the moment, I work with sound installation primarily. And the reason I'm taking this course is because like a year ago, I started a research project based on the recoding of preconceived physical and systemic structures to somehow create sustainable models of critical analysis that respond to the politics of the surrounding politics of data. And my definition of AI would be, I wrote it down yesterday. AI is a set of tools that use data to maximize a set of functions. And that's it.
Okay, data and functions. Yes, very interesting. All right, thank you. Nikita. Nikita, you are named after you share a name with a famous dissident.
That's who precisely?
Nechayev?
Oh, right. Yeah, there was one. Yeah.
Yeah, I wrote a paper on him a long time ago. He was quite an anarchist. He was.
Yeah, he was.
I believe he was the inspiration for Dostoevsky, the main character of Dostoevsky's Demons.
Yeah, that's right. He was pretty crazy as well. I mean, yeah. So, anyways, well,
okay,
sharing
so
that
name. We may have an anarchist here. All right, sorry.
I guess who in a couple of those. Yeah, I'm based in Moscow, and I work at Garage Museum of Contemporary Art, and among other things, well, yeah, there are two things I'm doing there. I'm working as a web development manager, so kind of manage the production of the museum's websites, apps, and stuff like that. Together with that, I'm research curator for a program the museum has, which is Garage Digital, which deals with emerging technologies in different ways. I'm pretty much interested in the cause, indeed, because we've just launched the program, and there are two works, artistic works that are based on artificial intelligence in their core. So that's why I'm quite interested in researching that. And as for what is AI, I really don't quite have a question, and I guess it's also pretty broad, because I would say that it's like pretty much any machine that is able to solve some problems, and I guess a calculator would do with that, and that would be something that would be called like weak AI, but we could also talk about like general AI, which is something completely different, capable of understanding, and that's also a question of telling what intelligence is as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I want to call out the problem-solving aspect. That actually is a very important term, and we will
Okay.
be revisiting both the problem and the solving part of that. Shilpi?
Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
Hi, I'm Shilpi. I am a communication designer, animation film designer, and illustrator from India. I currently work in the social development field as a consultant, and I don't have any experience in computer science or programming, and I have a very simplistic view of AI, probably. According to me, AI is an intelligence in machine which facilitates the machine to think and respond like human beings. Example, Siri.
Okay, there we go. I was muted. Yes, the measure of the human is, if you read the Turing paper, that is one of the foundational tenets of AI, and one that's been very hotly debated. Thank you. Let me see. Jamie?
Hello, I'm audible, yeah?
Yes.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Jamie. I'm at the New School for Social Research in New York City. I study a number of things right now, several of which pertain to space, terraforming, etc. I have a keen interest in biocomputers and applying current developments in biocomputing towards making actual biocomputers the way that developments in computing led to the emergence of actual computers. I don't disagree with any of the definitions of artificial intelligence that have been offered so far, but just to provoke or perturb or irk my peers, I'll define artificial intelligence as a current blueprint towards developing entirely new forms of life forms, entirely new organisms. Thank you.
Thank you. That's very interesting. I'm so tempted to ask questions, but I'll put that off for now. Stefano.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, nice to meet you, David. I'm Stefano. I'm based in Milan, Italy. My background is in philosophy. I've recently taken a master's degree in continental philosophy at the University of Warwick. I'm very interested in AI, though my knowledge is very patchy. With regards to your question, I guess I would say that I see AI as the sort of emulation of human intelligence that was ultimate aim is to overcome human intelligence. So to be very brief.
That's very good. There's a lot, actually, there's a lot in there. Thank you.
Thank you very
Jack.
much.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jack. I live in Los Angeles, California. My bachelor's degree is in English literature and criticism. And then my master's degree is in art and technology and integrated media. So more of the critical as well as art practice side of multimedia creativity. In terms of the artificial intelligence question, I don't have a fantastic answer. I guess something that I think about often is just more, there seems to be a sense of what is artificial intelligence that's actually just automation. I think that a lot of people want to say something is artificially intelligent just because it's doing something automatically. And that sort of confusion around algorithmic technologies seems very limiting and restraining in the sort of field of discussing what artificial intelligence really is. So,
Well, there are many people who have agreed with you, and we'll be seeing that.
yeah.
Thank you. And now I think Geronimo.
Yeah.
Would you like to?
Oh, I already went.
Oh, I'm sorry. Really? Okay. Okay, Alan?
Yep. Hi, everyone. My name is Alan. I'm from Mexico. Currently, my background is in architecture and critical theory. Currently, I'm in London doing a master in Goldsmiths in digital media theory. And well, my background, I don't have any background whatsoever in computer science or programming. Just in the discourse in critical theory around AI and particularly urban AI and urban computing. So yeah, I mean, what I want from this course is to get a bit more acquainted with like the technical aspects of AI, and I guess my definition would be that AI is the attempt of instantiating certain aspects of mind or thought in computational supports through several approaches from diverse disciplines such as cognitive science, engineering, computer science. And well, I'm not using the necessary term intelligence since that concept is already too broad, and I think it should be defined first and may even be useful as a kind of normative concept to separate between what, as Jack said, some things that are just barely automation and some things that can actually be called intelligent or whatever. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. And Guillermo?
Hi, I'm Guillermo. I'm based in Berlin, and my background is in, can you hear me? Yeah?
Yes.
And my background's in music, cool. And my background's in music production and composition. For the past years, I've been a little bit obsessed with AI and been researching the possibilities and impacts of AI towards creative practices, most explicitly music. My bachelor thesis last year in music production was entitled The Creative and Reductionist Paradox of AI, where ideas of how these systems could be used for creative outcomes in composition and audio generation were explored, their vast possibilities explained, and their underlying creative dangers, as well as the cultural and ontological implications that are associated with their use were discussed. I put side by side the paradox of possibilities enabled by AI methods with notions of technological determinism, augmentation reductionism, and the culture industry once these tools become available on a consumer level. And I'm currently taking a practice-based research MA, where I'm again exploring practical uses of AI in music and composition, audio generation, and style transfer methods. and I'm trying to develop customized tools to form specific artistic intents. I am not designing these models, I'm just appropriating GitHub models, basically, and trying to put them towards specific intents, basically using recurrent neural networks, generative adversarial networks, and variational autoencoders. Last night I wrote 2 paragraphs about artificial intelligence. The first one is very much a definition of it. Artificial intelligence, a broad branch part of the field of computer science, and is a general term first coined by McCarthy in '56 to refer to any technique that exists through the means of technology that appears to mimic, develop, or demonstrate human intelligence. McCarthy described the threshold of AI as getting a computer to do things which, when done by people, are said to involve intelligence. And the umbrella term of AI is part of a historical process that crystallizes notions of collective behavior, cultural data, and individual forms of intelligence into automated forms of complex tasks. Nowadays, AI is generally referred to agents that can respond to stimulation from human interactions through data mostly, and that can demonstrate a human-like capacity towards intentionality, forms of judgment, adaptability, and intention. Additionally, AI is related to the task of using computers to understand and create forms of human intelligence whilst not having to confine itself to methods that are biologically observable or limited. With the advent of deep learning and the common anthropomorphizing characteristics discussed by popular culture, I like to think of AI as basically predictive models of data. And yeah, and I also think that we, at this point in time, and basically due to the nefarious notions propagated by popular culture, that we should actually come up with a new term because it's so insidious, the common interpretation of AI, to the point that it's so complicated to get away from it. And yeah, that's basically my take and my background.
Okay, thank you. There's a lot there we'll be coming back to as well. And I think Alexei?
Hi, my name is Alexei. I'm from Belarus, but I'm based in Helsinki. I did my master's in cultural studies. So this field is quite new for me, but I'm taking an interdisciplinary track at the New Center. So I'm trying to see beyond the scope of my original research. So concerning AI affected by the readings for today, I would say that AI is something which is capable of performing things that are usually associated with human intelligence, like solving problems, learning or planning, speech recognition, stuff like that.
Okay, great, thank you. Is there anyone who hasn't introduced themselves? Hernan, did you want to go? For some reason you aren't.
No, it's fine. I think everybody introduced themselves.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you for those answers. It accomplished, I think, what I wanted to have accomplished, which is to see just what a wild diversity of answers you have to this to this question, to the extent that not just in terms of the definitions being used, but even what it is that you're trying to accomplish. You got mentioned, we got mention of creativity, problem solving, all these terms that are in general rather foreign to computer science and come out of psychology and conceptions of the human. And in many ways that gets at exactly why AI is such a thicket. So thank you for all of that. I'm glad we have a wide variety of experience. For people who may feel like the technical material is unfamiliar, please try not to worry about it too much and draw what you can from it. For people who find any of the material redundant and already know recurrent neural networks and restricted Boltzmann machines and things like that, let me know, and I'll give you far more technical readings if you're interested. I tried to strike a balance because I think, unfortunately, a lot of the non-technical material isn't very good, and a lot of the technical material is a bit verbose. That's actually one of the reasons why I sent out Melanie Mitchell's book. This book is actually quite good as a survey, and I wish it had come out a couple months earlier so I could have included it on the original syllabus. But I think that as a survey of just primarily connectionist and deep learning methods, it's a pretty good state of the field and a nice complement to the other historical readings we'll be doing. As far the Russell and Norvig chapter, the introduction from that is still, I think, the de facto AI textbook. It's very good, and I thought the introduction was sort of as good a canonical history of AI as existed. And if you are so inclined, it's certainly worth a read. And now some background. The schedule, I think, actually works out pretty well for us. We have 2 sessions before the winter break, and in some ways this will be a prelude to the real meat of the course, because, well, this week we're sort of just doing an overview, and after the overview, we'll be focusing a bit on the prehistory of AI and just framing the questions. And so that will keep us away from some of the more technical material until January, at which point, hopefully, you'll have had maybe a bit of extra time during the break to come to terms with anything that may be unfamiliar. And depending on where we are in the next 2 weeks, we can fill in some of the blanks if there's something broadly about AI that seems to urgently need discussing before we really dive into the weeds of the history. I hope that while I speak today, if you would like to think about if there's one particular topic or subtopic listed on the syllabus that you would like to present on, let me know and email me, I guess, email me after the session with maybe your top 3 choices of presentation, and I'll try to figure something out and announce it. If there's a lot of fighting over one particular topic, I may ask one person to pick something else.
Presentation and response choices as well.
Sorry?
So we need responders for the presentations as well. So each student has to do a presentation and a response.
Okay.
They choose when to respond and when to present. I mean, like 3 and 3, I guess.
Okay. Okay. Is it a response to every presentation or one specific presentation?
There should be a response for every presentation. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. And is that given within the class or after the class?
Within the class, like
okay.
It's like consecutive to the presentation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Perfect. Okay. And I would like you all to be thinking of a final paper, or at least start to think about it, and hopefully have a suggestion of what you'd like to, the broad topic you'd like to write on, ideally before the break, but if not, then sort of, actually, let's try to have it by January, where you can say it. And I'm open to changes, but you can just run your topic by me. I can do a check to see if, I think this is something that's manageable in the time frame. So, all right, now we're gonna begin. I hope that the survey readings from Nilsson and Russell and Norvig and Mitchell were helpful in providing at least a general background and context. I'm not going to reiterate that history point by point, but if I'm gliding over the terms too fast, send a chat message, I guess, if there's something in particular that I'm going on about that you need me to slow down on. So as part of this archaeology, we're going to examine AIs from several views, and there's 3 primarily that I'm thinking of, which are technological, philosophical, and psychological. And linked to all of those, which I'll get to after I've spoken to those three, is the transcendental view. And I mean that in a very Kantian sense, and you'll see why. I'm going to ramble a bit intentionally because I don't want to rat hole on any particular approach this time. And I think by sort of ping-ponging between them, it'll give a better idea of just how fluid things are. I think the introductions we just did gave a pretty good idea of that too. And I'm going to tilt this down. All right. First, I want to speak a little about that word paradigm and what I mean by it in this context. I figure that a lot of you are familiar with Thomas Kuhn, who wrote The Structure of Scientific Revolutions and popularized the notion of the paradigm shift in science. And he is the big name in sort of relativizing and contextualizing and historicizing scientific thinking. And you know that still gets played out in both high and low ways. And I think one of the biggest examples today is probably around string theory, where people are like, where the string theory proponents are, this is a real advance, and the string theory opponents are, no, it's just a paradigm, and and it will pass just like anything else. And the most memorable phrasing of the concept of paradigm shift was, I think, decades earlier by Max Planck, and the physicist Max Planck, who Kuhn quotes in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And what he said was, a new scientific truth does not generally triumph by persuading its opponents and getting them to admit their errors, but rather by its opponents gradually dying out and giving way to a new generation that is raised on it. An important scientific innovation rarely makes its way by gradually winning over and converting its opponents. What does happen is that its opponents gradually die out and that the growing generation is familiarized with the ideas from the beginning. Another instance of the fact that the future lies with the youth. The quick paraphrase of that paragraph is, science progresses one funeral at a time. That as long as you have these eminent people who are attached to their ideas, they're just going to prevent progress until they actually die. And although capital plays a bigger role these days, and with regard to deep learning, you could say that science progresses one IPO at a time. We could say that the movement of capital, in some ways, has also started to heavily influence scientific paradigm shifts. Google bought DeepMind and they beat Go, and that was a result of their search engine ad business, which didn't have that much to do with AI at all. Regardless, though, the point is, this isn't some abstract impersonal process. Kuhn says that too, but even he, I think, portrays it as a somewhat less sheerly contingent process than the way I'd like us to be looking at it. And I find Kuhn to be a little overrated in that you can see a lot of his ideas in some of the people that came before him. And I'm thinking of Pierre Duhem and Quine and Mary Hess. And even if you go back to Charles Sanders Peirce in the 19th century. But Kuhn phrased it memorably, and his is the big name. And so it's easy to talk away about Kuhnian paradigm shifts in science the way that you would talk about streams of thought in some other area. You see the idea of paradigm shifts less in mathematics, because I think there the concepts are just a lot more arcane and people don't talk about group theory in quite the way they do about the Big Bang or quantum loop gravity. But Imre Lakatos, and following on from him, Morris Klein, actually, I think I'm mistaken there. Some Brewerian mathematicians also, I think, had something of a similar impact there. Anyway, don't worry if these names are unfamiliar. The basic thrust, though, is paradigms. My point is that the sort of historical contextualization or archaeology has not happened in quite the same way for AI as it even has for physics or biology. And one of the questions that I want to investigate is why that is. There have been plenty of fights between the various AI factions, but on a higher level, there isn't this sort of theoretical paradigm war in the ahistorical sense. There's a good book by Pedro Domingos called The Master Algorithm. I recommend it. And his position is that you have these competing approaches to AI, which you could be called paradigms, maybe not, and that he thinks they can just be synthesized into one gigantic approach to AI that will actually work and do what we dream AI is supposed to do, whatever it is that you think it's supposed to do. But that's the path forward to AI. Dominguez is smarter than me, and I'm not going to say that. So I can't say that his approach isn't what's going to happen in the future. But I'm citing his book to point out that there is sort of a ahistorical and synthetic and almost Whiggish approach to AI frequently, where you don't see it as agonistic or dialectical, even though the history is there to show that it obviously has been. And that's another question to keep in mind is, why is that? Why isn't AI portrayed that way on a daily basis? So as far as history has impacted artificial intelligence, how has it done so? Well, the first level is the technological level. AI doesn't really come into existence in the first place until actual computers that can do things existed in the 1940s. They were very primitive, but you finally had, it was as though AI did not emerge concurrently quite with a theory of computation or with logic, which is related, which is it's handmaiden. But AI emerges with the actual machines themselves. It's as though the very act of seeing those machines chunking punch cards made people think, could that act like a human? Even as though the question had never occurred to them before. And that that delay there reminds me a bit of how it's like how the Greeks did all this advanced mathematics, and yet had an acute allergy to actually putting mathematics into any sort of practical application. So you had an inventor like Hero, and he was looked down upon, while Pythagoras, who at this point, it's not even clear how much math he even knew, became the leader of a cult and and you got these numerological mythos around mathematical theorems and practices. But people didn't even think, well, could we use this to help blow people up? Which today seems like the most obvious question from any scientific discovery. And that separation of theory and practice is a really funny thing, and it even persists today in the division between computer scientists and software engineers and hardware engineers as well. There are computer science people who absolutely hate the idea of programming, and there are many programmers who not only know very little of computer science, but don't even like to do mathematics. Back in the day when disks were copy protected, there was one game designer, Chris Crawford, who said, if you want to make your copy protection hard to beat, just have the algorithm involve some sort of complicated mathematics, and that'll stop most hackers in their tracks. I liked coding. I always liked coding, but again, I was sort of split between it too, because I like the theory of it too, but I didn't want to just be doing theorems and proofs about computation. I actually did like getting out there and building things. But from my perspective, I think it is very helpful to understand the conceptual underpinnings and even the the stack of how processing occurs. I think I was fortunate in some ways in that, growing up on what today would be an incredibly primitive computer, the Apple IIe, you could see most of the layers in practice. You could see how you went from, the programming language to the machine language that was actually being operated. And so there weren't so many levels that you couldn't grasp the entire movement of the whole. And I think that's an invaluable ability to have. And one of course, the funny things about AI is that AI seems to get more successful the harder it is to understand, even more so than computer programs, far more so. And perhaps that is connected to how technology has been connected, how technology itself has been connected to the progress of AI. And for each of these paradigms, I would say, for each of the 4 paradigms, you can see a concurrent technical advancement that either triggered it or accompanied it, depending on your perspective. cybernetics, which is the first paradigm in the 1940s, it's the advent of the actual working computer in practical terms, that people are seeing, wow, we can get a machine that can calculate faster than a human and can calculate in an automated way. For symbolic AI in the 50s, which starts in the 50s, it's the rise of mainframe computers, fairly well available to corporations and research institutions, and these mainframes were made possible by the invention of the transistor, which greatly increased the ability of processors and set off Moore's law. Now, I suspect most of you have heard of Moore's law, which is that, loosely speaking, is computer processing power accelerates exponentially, that it doubles every 12 to 24 months. And for a long time, this was certainly true. People wonder if we're reaching the end of Moore's law, and there are physical limitations, but processing power is still increasing. But the specific coinage of Moore's law was that it relates to the number of circuits integrated circuits you can fit on a chip in terms of space, and that relates to transistors, which is how small can you make a transistor, which is one of the basic elements of creating CPUs. And that, it turned out, could progress at an exponential rate, and that is why you have computers today that are that are hundreds of millions times more powerful and efficient than computers 50 years ago. So at the time of symbolic AI, you were already starting to have computers that were exponentially more powerful than the computers you'd had in the 40s. And you could do large-scale math and you could do fast operations. And that, as we will see, greatly informed the symbolic AI paradigm in terms of what they tried to do, how they framed it, the limitations that they were and were not aware of, and the ultimate displacement of that paradigm. For connectionism, the neural network related paradigm that occurs in that sort of really bursts out in the 80s, I'd say that the technological advancement there was again the increase in processing power that started to displace the mainframe with the personal computer. So you now no longer need access to a shared mainframe that you have to schedule time on. You can actually, you've got your own computer, it's extremely powerful, and it can sort of run on its own without fixed time slices and do its thing, perhaps more opaquely. Simultaneously, you had a lot of discoveries in neuroscience about the structure and function of the brain, and that was a huge inspiration to people doing the work in connectionism. And following on from that, for deep learning, it's the explosion of big data and the absolutely ludicrous amounts of processing power and data both. One of the statistics I like to cite is that there's more data produced every day in terms of computational data that you can represent as writing or numerically. More data is now produced every day than was produced in the entire history of humanity up until the year 2000. So that changes the game, and that is what why deep learning I think deserves to be called a different paradigm. And I say that because there's a strange knot of dependencies, because some of the most influential people in deep learning are the same people who are influential in connectionism. In particular, Geoffrey Hinton, whose presentation I signed for today, he's at Google Brain, and Jan LeCun, who is the chief AI scientist at Facebook. And LeCun was a student of Hinton's, and they've both been around from the 80s doing their things. So you have this bizarre situation where these connectionist algorithms that were pioneered in the 1980s, they go into a bit of hibernation in the 1990s, where people are like, well, it's interesting, but it doesn't seem to, it's not good. It's not good enough. And then they explode in the 2000s and 2010s because suddenly there's enough data and processing power to get incredible results in image recognition, speech recognition, recommendation engines, playing chess and Go and other areas. So with regard to deep learning, the question is, the obvious question is, if it's the same people and same algorithms, and similar algorithms, there've been developments, but you're looking at an evolution. Is it really a new paradigm? And I really do think it is. Besides the practical impact, the discourse around AI has radically changed, and even the claims around it have changed. And I don't want to spoil it by getting into exactly how it's changed, because it's not a simple question, but all that extra data and processing power, alongside the move from primarily academic-based research and government-funded research to this hybrid of corporate and academic research that we have today, and something of a withdrawal of the government from that sphere, those changes profoundly affected the evolution of AI research and conceptions of AI, so that a connectionist pioneer like Hinton has found himself in a radically different context, even though his personal philosophy of AI hasn't radically changed. General approach to AI has remained mostly similar. So from a history and philosophy of science perspective, that particular shift from connectionism to deep learning is an exceptionally strange one because of the speed of technological acceleration, specifically within computer science, and its impact on society, and how that forced huge shifts in how AI is researched and deployed. And following on from that, the question is, if each paradigm seems to match up with a certain technological progression, well, how independent are these paradigms from technological developments? Why is even the theory itself of AI and the conception of thinking so seemingly parasitic on the development of specific technology that is not specific to AI, that is not particular to artificial intelligence? And that's something we'll think about as well. And if you'll excuse me now, I'm going to refill my glass of water because I'm getting over a cold. I'll be right back.
We can take a break if you want, David.
Sorry?
We can take a break if you're up for it.
Let's see, I guess we are at the halfway mark. Does everyone want to, yeah, would everyone like to stretch their legs for 5 minutes or something and think and discuss or what have you?
Yeah, why not?
Okay.
Sure.
Okay.
Okay. See you in 5 minutes.
Okay. Or sooner if everybody is back. But yeah, let's say 12:15. Okay.
Hello, Brian. Are you there?
Yes, yeah, I am.
Hi. Because I think it's much easier to answer directly than in text. So as I said, I have no pre-knowledge about AI, but maybe when I know that there is this overall project of understanding how the human brain works, how the human mind works through building an artificial intelligence. And so maybe like that it's actually trying to answer the question of what is natural intelligence by answering the question what is artificial intelligence and how does it function. So I think they are not as distinct as it may seem, but maybe we can ask David. These are just my thoughts on that.
Let's see. I guess my answer to Brian would be, well, first we got to figure out what even intelligence is before dividing it into subcategories. So I think there's a lot of circular dependencies. That intelligence gets defined as being natural intelligence, and then when you want to move beyond the idea of natural intelligence, you start to saying, okay, well, what's intelligence that's not natural? Is it just whatever? Is it intelligence that acts natural that happens to be non-biological, or is it, or can we define it as something that humans can't even understand? We'll see a lot of that. Yeah, Akeen raises a lot of issues that I'll be speaking to a bit of them later in this session, and it'll take some time to tease out the various threads. Chomsky's a very interesting figure because he was involved with a lot of the progenitors of AI, but Chomsky, I guess he was smart in a way in saying, I'm dealing exclusively with syntax and semantics is just too damn hard. And certainly as far as impact goes, that probably was the right call because there's a lot more concrete progress that could be made with linguistics. Now, the irony is that the universal language, his universal language theory, there's some debate. I think the jury's still out as to whether the language works in the sort of computational functional way that he claims it does. But in choosing to computationalize a problem that could at least be very well specified, in that we can specify syntax in a way that we can't specify thinking, Chomsky kind of made the right, probably made a smart call. There's a great book actually that I wanted to recommend. I didn't put it on the syllabus just because too much to this, but it's by Heinz Pagels, and it's called the Dreams of Reason, and it straddles all these questions in a very, very profound way. I think it's from 1988. I think it holds up incredibly well. And it has a lot more philosophy. Hey, it's Heb's rule. Yeah, it has a lot more like philosophical perspective than a lot of such books. You always get these. There are people like Pagels and Giancarlo Rota who, you know, for whatever reason, decide that there's really something in the core of philosophy that's really useful to physics or computer science, and produces good books.
David, are you familiar at all with cortical conductor theory by Joshua Bach?
Familiar with it? I'll say no. How about that? Familiar is a loaded term. I mean, I know the basic idea of it, and it certainly, you know, it relates to it. It certainly it has the ideas involved are obviously very tightly connected to certain ideas of reinforcement learning and neural networks. Whether it can produce consciousness, I wouldn't claim to have any position on that. Oh, what do you think?
I mean, it's I guess that I would agree with you. I mean, the production of consciousnesses, I was very influenced by Intelligence and Spirit's sort of conclusion of socialization as, you know, the scaffolding of human level intelligence and its collective closure with, you know, consciousness. But I do find it, you know, to be a well-made argument. It's a paper I've been returning a bit to, particularly the way he teases out Leibniz.
Yeah. Well, maybe.
It's a short paper, but I mean,
yeah, maybe we can fit it. I'll let me look back at it and see what we can do with it. It's actually a good lead in to the rest of the lecture today. So if everyone's here, I'm going to get back to it. Is there any? I guess I'll ask now. Is there any other questions anyone had? Not specifically for questions on the material. Let's wait until the quick Q&A. But if there's any logistical questions, if anyone's having trouble understanding me, anything like that. Okay. All right. I'm going to continue. So having done technology, let's now go to that philosophical standpoint. In the most dominant areas being philosophy of language and philosophy of mind, though other things creep in as well, and logic, of course. But if you want to consider logic to be the exclusive provision of philosophy, computer science has been very tightly tied to analytic philosophy from the very beginning, and a lot of that is because of the role logic has played, but also just because of the overlap in some of the personalities involved. And the wellspring here is the Vienna Circle, which is the early 20th century Middle European group of ultra-analytical philosophers and logicians, including Reza's hero Rudolf Carnap, who is an incredibly important figure. But if you look on Facebook, you can see Reza calling me a dirty Quinian because I think Carnap's approach has some limitations. But you have Carnap, you have Otto Neurath, you have Moritz Schlick, you have Kurt Gödel, whose logical work is not only central to computer science, but has had an incredible impact. The idea of incompleteness has been one that people have been driving everybody crazy since Gödel discovered it. The idea that any sufficiently complex mathematical system is not complete, that there are theorems or statements in it that cannot be proven within that system. And in addition to Carnap and Gödel and all those, he wasn't a member, but the early work of Wittgenstein, the Tractatus, was incredibly influential on the Vienna Circle. Although Wittgenstein, came to turn against everything the Vienna Circle stood for, and the case has been made that he didn't quite support them in the first place, and the Tractatus didn't actually say a lot of what the Vienna Circle thought it did. But for our purposes here, the key point is that a lot of post-World War II analytic philosophy, as well as other harder fields like linguistics and economics, fell out of the Vienna Circle's hyper-positivistic approach. And by hyper-positivistic, I mean, Carnap wrote papers called "The End of Metaphysics." The metaphysical statements just they can't be proven one way or the other, so they should just be cast to the flames. Noam Chomsky was affiliated with the Vienna Circle, and we'll see a lot of links to them when we get to the second paradigm, symbolic AI, where you have these figures like Herbert Simon, who have a direct lineage to the Vienna Circle. And it's funny because, while this link is immense, people don't talk about it all that much. Margaret Bowden covers it a fair bit in her very good book, Mind is Machine, which is her history of cognitive science, but covers AI a lot in the course of that. And I've assigned a couple chapters from it. The book is 1,600 pages. It's a very good read if you ever, need a beach read. There you go. But I suspect the reason why most people don't treat this connection in greater depth is that despite the early connections, the increased specialization in disciplines has really drawn computer science, including AI, apart from philosophy. And so most histories just consider one side or another. You have exceptions, and I think that the Pagel's book is one of them. But broadly speaking, you're not going to find a lot about Carnap, even in a book about the dawn of AI. And I think that inevitably makes the story partial. So beyond Kurt Gödel and Alonzo Church, whose work in logic also had a monumental impact on computer science, you also have Alan Turing, who wasn't strictly speaking a philosopher, but who I think it's fair to say had more philosophical impact on how we think about AI than most analytic philosophers then or now, simply by posing the question very memorably of whether machines could think and what that meant. He wasn't the first to pose that question, and he didn't pose it in a definitive way, but everybody knows what the Turing Test is, and we're going to talk about it later in this session. And at least everybody thinks they know what the Turing Test is. And Turing's overall genius and contribution make him pretty indispensable to the story. And that's why we're reading him first, because no matter what paradigm we're dealing with after 1950, Turing approaching the problem is something that everyone is either explicitly or implicitly addressing. Now, on the other hand, aside from AI proper, the philosophy of AI and its connection to philosophy of mind retreats into something of an academic clique that becomes a bit separate from actual AI research. There's an anthology in 1981 called The Mind's Eye, which was edited by Douglas Hofstadter, the computer scientist, and Daniel Dennett, who's a philosophy of mind. And the anthology was a collection of creative and philosophical pieces about human and machine thinking. And I think because of Hofstadter, as well as Dennett, it's much more informed by computer science than most such collections. And it's also far more informed by philosophy because of Dennett's coming out of that. Dennett was a student of Wilfrid Sellars, for what that's worth. That's another interesting underground lineage that I think, if it were understood better, would make people look at Dennett's philosophy differently. But that's a side point. So how has anyone here read the Mind's Eye or pieces from it? I guess not. It's interesting. It was a big book back in the day. It's an important book, and there's lots of great stuff in it. But you know, if you do read it, you'll notice there's not a lot of actual dialogue going on. And where there is dialogue, it's frequently the dialogue of the deaf. And I think that if you read it, it does give this impression that by 1981, analytic philosophy and AI had gone their separate ways, and that but for, you know, Dennett and Hofstadter hooking up, you wouldn't quite have even these people in the same room or the same book. Now, Dennett went on to write a book in the 1990s called Consciousness Explained, which was often nicknamed Consciousness Explained Away or Consciousness Ignored, because it took the position that I just got a question. What of David Deutsch? I'm going to postpone that question for now. We will get to that. Excuse me. But so Dennett took the position that a lot of what classically we think of as classically constituting consciousness is an illusion. There's no unified Cartesian theater where we have mental representations of reality, for example. And the classic reply to Dennett is that we define consciousness as that which can't be illusory. If I'm experiencing a representation of something, that experience can't be an illusion because the very nature of an experience is that it's real, or as real as an experience can be. Even if you're having a hallucination, it's still a real hallucination. And again, you get a dialogue of the deaf on that sort of issue because neither side is going to budge on whether a concept like experience is intrinsically real or illusory. And that's, I think, the level of dispute that occurs around a lot of the philosophical arguments around AI. One of the pieces in The Mind's Eye is by John Searle, the Chinese room argument. How many of you are familiar with the Chinese room argument?
Yes, I am.
Mm-hmm. I'm not going to get into it that much. It's a clever thought experiment that claims to prove that computers can only simulate thought, but they can't really think. But the thing is, you know, even Searle's contribution was fairly ancillary relative to the direction of AI. I mean, there's arguments over it, but I don't really see where people said, oh yeah, this means we got to change our approach to like how we're building AI. The direction of AI was much more being determined through government grants and research labs more than by such philosophical contributions like Searle's. And I think that bifurcation continued well into the 90s, where philosophers thought about consciousness, like David Chalmers, and AI researchers were just thinking about how to keep the field of AI conscious. And the concerns diverged, despite the fact that you really did have that common history. So that's the brief relationship of analytic philosophy and computer and AI. What about continental philosophy and any other traditions? And the impact there, for a variety of historical reasons, has been a lot more scattershot. One person we'll get to who is significant is Hubert Dreyfus, who was at Berkeley for a long time and happened to be at the Rand Institute in California in the 1960s when a lot of the symbolic AI people were were plying their trade. And he used Heidegger, and specifically being in time, not the question concerning technology, to critique the ambitions of symbolic AI. And I mean, Dreyfus is an interesting figure, surely because he was at the Rand Institute in the 60s talking about Heidegger of all people. Must have been a very strange time. Dreyfus made a bet that paid off quite well, which was that symbolic AI people were overstating their claims and that AI wasn't going to happen in 5 or 10 years, which is what the symbolic AI, general AI, whatever, the impressive AI, we could say, what the symbolic people AI were promising was not going to happen. Now, did he need Heidegger to make that counterclaim? Probably not. Dreyfus's argument, in my view, boils down to what he calls background knowledge and what others have called common sense, the holistic array of knowledge and beliefs you need to operate in the world beyond just, playing checkers or chess or solving a very restricted problem. And there's something of Heidegger's know-how in that, for sure, but I'm not as confident that Heidegger is the originator of that line of thought. But if you're looking for the biggest impact of continental philosophy on the direction of AI, that's definitely a candidate. Dreyfus had a number of students, in particular John Haugland, who continued to critique AI from a vaguely neo-Heideggerian standpoint. But their work is interesting, but I still find it to be somewhat ancillary for archaeological purposes, which are purposes. There's also some people like Humberto Maturana and Francisco Varela, who are sometimes called second or third generation or second or third order cyberneticists and sometimes neurophenomenologists. I don't know if they qualify as continental philosophy, but they are a breed apart from the analytic tradition. They have concepts like autopoiesis, which is a concept far closer to something like Deleuze and Guattari's rhizomes than to anything analytic philosophy would ever touch. And you also have critical theory like Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto. But again, I find this work to be fairly ancillary to the dominant historical progress of AI, which isn't to say we won't touch on it, but I don't see a lot of communication between those fields. So archaeologically speaking, I do see the main impact as being from the analytic tradition, and specifically from the positivistic and logistic tradition. And that had a lot of consequences, good and bad. And one of the questions I hope that you'll keep in mind is that when the positivistic tradition failed to provide satisfactory answers in how to get good results in AI, where did the field of AI turn? Well, they didn't turn to Heidegger, I'll tell you that. All right, instead, AI turned in a big way to neuroscience and to the brain. And this is where the third viewpoint I mentioned after technological and philosophical comes in, which is the psychological viewpoint. And we'll see psychology enter in the broader sense from the very beginning, but it will then get overshadowed in the symbolic AI period because the idea of how humans work and function in the world becomes less important than an abstracted conception of universal or dehumanized thinking. And that's the sort of, one could call it the hubris of the symbolic AI period. The hubris of the connectionist period, which follows it, is that of thinking that we actually understand how the brain works and we can replicate it with computers. I'm not using hubris in a particularly judgmental way. You always have something to aim at, and frequently you have to cope with failing to hit it. But once the physical embodied brain gets reintroduced as a potential model for AI in the connectionist period, it lets a lot of other things in through the back door too, because instead of considering thought in the abstract and wiping away anything about humans and the brain that is inconvenient or needlessly complicated, you're now considering aspects with connectionism of biology, cognitive science, psychology, sociology, everything else you can imagine to figure out how it is that humans are able to function in the world in the first place. Just tried to limit themselves to the brain and how it worked, and they did draw some real insights from it. The problem is that ultimately we don't have any idea how the brain works in isolation, but only from how it interacts via a body with its environment. And that's the open door I mentioned, which lets everything back in. So keep an eye on that. And it's in this conjunction that I hope that the excerpts from the Valentino Breitenberg book Vehicles are helpful, because he wants to say, okay, yes, these biological models are important, but it's the complexity of the human brain that's causing us to have all these misunderstandings. And instead, let's consider how we might build a brain from the ground up, something that acts intelligently, even though its inner workings are not that complex. And Breitenberg in the book, he dismisses philosophers a number of times for being too obsessed with the human mind and too obsessed with consciousness. The irony there is that a lot of analytic philosophers had been trying to had been making the same criticism of other philosophers, saying you're too mind obsessed and consciousness obsessed, and trying to move towards a more behavioral or functionalist paradigm. And again, there's the division there. So Breitenberg shifts the focus away from the question, what is thinking? And instead of, okay, well, how does one get complex and intelligent behavior from a simple organism, whether it's a single-celled organism or a primitive robot? And that's a very different starting point. You set aside human thinking, and instead you consider what might be the original building blocks of human thinking. This is a major theme in some biological research, such as that by John Tyler Bonner on slime molds, and these very simple organisms that somehow act either individually or collectively in surprisingly complex ways. And that's the movement we want in AI, right? We want to write simple programs that generate complex behaviors. And Breitenberg portrays this approach quite elegantly in saying that if we just stop thinking about thinking, we could actually get thinking eventually. And this brushes away not just the concerns of a great number of philosophers, but also those of the symbolic AI pioneers who are very aggressive in saying that we could do thinking first and behavior afterwards. There's a vaguely naturalist argument about evolution you hear, which is that, you know, for AI, ontogeny should recapitulate phylogeny, or that ontogeny needs to recapitulate phylogeny, or else you're never going to get, you know, anywhere. Thinking isn't some innate abstract ability. It emerges out of brains, and brains go through massive biological processes of development before any serious thinking emerges. And since that's the only thinking we've ever really encountered, unless you're Herbert Simon, and in 1956 you say, over the Christmas holiday, Al Newell and I invented a thinking machine. If you aren't Simon and you think, like most of us, that biological entities are still the only ones doing any actual thinking, then you better start looking to those biological entities as a reference. Whatever it is can occur in the first place. And as I said, this tension plays itself even within philosophy. There's a duel between the functionalist outside-in neo-behaviorist approach and the mentally focused inside-out, we all know what thinking is, so let's start from there and work our way and work our way out approach. It's less a Copernican turn than a Copernican double star, with gravity sort of pulling thinking one way or the other, almost arbitrarily at times. With AI, it's a bit of a cleaner progression because the mental logical representation approach of the symbolic AI people suffered such a huge blow in the 70s, and consequently there was a far more decisive turn towards looking to produce intelligent behavior rather than to produce thinking per se. At the same time, when you have this shift towards a functionalist, somewhat black box definition of cognition, a number of questions get marginalized, such as, for example, what is thinking? The more you take the brain as a model of thinking, then whatever it is the brain does is thinking, so you don't need to worry about defining it, you only need to imitate it. And this goes hand in hand with one of the core themes of the connectionist paradigm, which is learning. Symbolic AI considered thinking, but didn't talk as much about learning, at least not in the way that a child, say, learns to distinguish colors. They thought that, you know, the symbolic AI people thought that if you could give a computer a ready-made scheme of the world, and then thinking would happen. With connectionism, you get far more of a focus on the problem of how a computer could itself learn and create, say, Kantian categories in the first place, and just how hard a process that is. Because the connectionists ultimately come up against the same problem that neuroscientists do, which is that you can't open the brain and see the Kantian category boxes and how they're divided up. It's the same old mind-brain dualism problem all over again, and it's no wonder that it's symbolic the AI people wanted to avoid that. They figured they could build the mind and ignore the brain. And it turns out that you can't, or at least the symbolic AI people couldn't, and today we can. So it was back to the brain. And so ironically, through the psychological approach, we actually go back in time to an earlier form of philosophy, which is the good old Kantian transcendental question. What are the necessary conditions for the possibility of thought and experience? I don't see this brought up too frequently in the context of connectionism or deep learning, But beyond the cross-disciplinary isolation, I do think that AI people don't want to complicate their lives any further. So a de facto answer has emerged. The necessary conditions for the possibility of thought are whatever it is the brain does that make it appear as though someone is thinking. It's a functionalist, quasi-behavioral, quasi-biological answer, and in no way does it seem like it had to be the answer we would arrive at today. So that's the core question of our class. How did we get to the answer to this? How did we get to that answer to the transcendental question of the necessary conditions for the possibility of thinking in a machine, but also so for that question, let's look at Turing. I assigned 2 papers by him. The 1950 paper, which I'm going to pull up here, Computing Machinery and Intelligence, is one of the most famous papers of the 20th century, in my opinion. Turing was an absolute genius. His early death was an incredible loss, and I think people still don't realize just how far ahead of the curve he was. The one other person I would rank on that level is John von Neumann, who gave us the von Neumann architecture model of the computer. And he was in many ways Turing's absolute opposite. He was a hyper-elitist, hyper-establishment, hyper-rational being. And a lot of Turing's questions would never have even occurred to von Neumann, and I suspect he never came to care about them even after he heard them. There's a story about von Neumann. He didn't have much to do with his daughter until she was 12 because he didn't think kids were really interesting until that point. Well, from the perspective of AI, kids are actually quite interesting, and that's not really what von Neumann cared about. He wanted the life of the mind, pure and simple. Turing's a lot more well-rounded, but a lot more eccentric as well, and he puts his finger right on the crux at the very beginning of this article, which is to say, okay, what is thinking? And if you read the Denise Cummins paper, that's still a big question. What is thinking? And yeah, to Aiken, we can say, yeah, what is intelligence? So I'd like to ask people later what their thoughts on Turing is, but I'll say a few words first myself. So we start off with the test itself, which is called the imitation game. And Turing starts off with a lesser known version of the test, which doesn't involve a computer at all. Instead of a computer pretending to be a man to fool a judge, it's a man who is pretending to be a woman. Oh yeah, let me address Eric's question right here. There's AI research without a clear one. Well, I think to that I would say, well, you're doing AI research with an implicit definition, and making that the implicit definition explicit is very tricky. And I've been trying to speak to, I think, what that implicit definition has arrived at and how unsatisfactory it might be. And by tracing the evolution of that implicit definition, hopefully we'll get to a little more clarity.
Okay. Just a very short comment. So this even if it's an implicit definition, this is not equal to thinking, is it? Because then they wouldn't ask the question, what is thinking? Or would say, okay, we don't need to not consider it. So intelligence and thinking are at least not equal from the outright beginning.
Well, it's interesting because, you know, the name of the article is Computer Machinery and Intelligence, but we're talking about thinking. So you have these two concepts that are very clearly related, but I do think that there's linguistic associations in which one gets pulled to the other. So keep that in mind as we go through this. So Turing's first test is, you're not a computer pretending to be a man. It's a man pretending to be a woman trying to fool a judge into getting the identifications wrong, to saying, oh, this man is a more convincing woman than this woman who I'm just speaking to. And Turing says the judge can be a man or a woman, which is an interesting point as well, since one might think that women might do better as the judge than men. So having established this, Turing says, okay, let's swap roles. Instead of the man as the faker and the woman as the honest one, you now have the computer as the faker and the man as the honest one. And now, so now the man is being honest and the computer is pretending to be the man, and the woman's just out of the picture. And here's Turing's metric for can machines think. He says the machine has to falsely convince a judge that it's a man as often as a man can falsely convince a judge that he's a woman. We don't know what percentage of the time that is. It might not even be that high. Usually people conceive of the Turing test in terms of, well, can a computer convince humans most of the time or at least half the time? But Turing wants it defined very specifically relative to human success at imitating, and specifically a man's success at imitating a woman. So the question is, what makes that particular bar significant? Well, it's a fundamentally social test, and that's why the gender example that he begins with is significant. And the profound thing about the Turing test is that it tries to define thinking in terms of three overlapping concepts. First, pretending, second, lying, and third, convincing. Pretending in the sense that the machine has to make statements about itself in which it constitutes itself in a social role different to the one it actually inhabits. Not only does this require foreign knowledge that's alien to one's social role, just as a man might need to know a lot of things about being a woman that most men would not know, it also requires assembling that knowledge into a unified picture. That unified picture being the social role. On top of that, the machine then has to lie. It needs to know what true statements would be false if it were a human, and it needs to be able to paint a detailed verbal picture to the judge where those lies won't be obvious. So there needs to be some kind of mechanism for gauging when a lie is required and what form the lie should take in order to make it seem like the machine is actually human. Again, this is what the man is doing when he's pretending to be a woman. And that follows on to the third challenge of convincing. I mean, the machine needs to have a good enough idea of the judge's psychology so that it can play to them and gauge what this particular judge is willing to buy. So the machine is embedded in this social context with a specific audience to which the computer is trying to make a case, a false case as it happens. But I think it's a significant part of the Turing test that a machine is being asked to make an implied argument, which is that it's human. And for that, it needs to have notions of all sorts of semantic and discursive practices of arguing and convincing. Now, when you see articles on how some Turing test took place and how some machine convinced the judges, nothing like what I've just been describing is happening. Natural language is a notorious Achilles heel of artificial intelligence. And whenever a program has convinced a judge that it's human, there's definitely been nothing like this level of sophistication in play. There was there's a chatbot that got called mGons that got a human to converse with it for over an hour without realizing he was talking to this incredibly simple chatbot. And the reason was the chatbot was just incredibly abusive and never answered questions and kept insulting the human. And that's not it's not wholly trivial, but it's certainly one can say that you're doing a bit of a parlor trick in order to pass the test in that case. You could argue that Turing wouldn't care and that you pass the test, you pass the test. But the rest of the paper signals that Turing was at least concerned with something a lot deeper than a purely behavioral passing of the test by hook or by crook. Turing really does believe that thinking is defined as performing in human social contexts. And while the imitation game provides one social context, its value is in providing indicators of those larger acts of pretending, lying, convincing, which can be said to be some of the most central human acts there are. And we're a long way from logic and analytic philosophy here. This is far more late Wittgenstein than early Wittgenstein. But there's a tension in the paper too. Turing alternates between the brute facts of computation and computational theory as it existed then, which he had a huge role in pioneering. And on the other hand, his theories as to what a thinking machine might require. And one surprise in that regard, he devotes a significant section to learning and positive and negative reinforcement and the concept of educating a computer. If you on page 442, he speaks very starkly of providing a computer with a program to pass the test, as though all these social codes he's talking about could be represented by a discrete program rather than embedding the computer in some greater social environment. But by page 456, he's now talking about simulating a child's mind and raising a machine in the same way that it's a child. He talks about, okay, well, the child can be seen as, well, you have the initial state of the mind, the education to which a child is subjected, and you have other experience, which is not education, which has also been subjected. And so there's this semi-autonomous process of developing, thinking. And then he makes the move from having a human, on page 458, he makes the move from having a human provided program to thinking that computers will modify their own code, which is something they certainly do, but didn't do back then. And he says that these self-modifying programs are going to become more opaque, and he's certainly right on that. But in other words, machines learn in the same way that humans do, he's saying, from the outside in, and we don't need to know, and we won't know the exact nature of the process, since the act of learning is, in a significant sense, the act of programming oneself. And I think Turing hones in on a lot of issues here, and they're obscured, I think, by some of the technical material and by the cruder idea of the Turing test as it has been received. But beyond that, he himself, I think, displays attention. On the one hand, he is portraying this deterministic model of computation in which fixed programs are fed into a machine. And on the other hand, he's saying that a lot of that may well have to be thrown out just to get to the level of passing a purely behavioral test. Aiken just brought up Eugene Guzman. And I would say Guzman is another example of the sort of parlor tricks things whereby having this was another program that was pretty good at convincing judges that it was human, but by having it pretend to be a foreign language, a child who spoke a foreign language, it put up barriers to some of the human indicators that a judge would often use to be able to peg a computer as not being human. In other words, you're setting up a social context that is easier to pass than others. And while that may not violate the letter of the law, I do think that you're dodging the spirit of the test as Turing frames it. If you want support on this, you could. The other Turing paper we had in 1947, you'll see him talking about at the end about a machine that can, quote, learn from experience when playing chess. So even there, the idea of learning is very important. And because he says the machine, this is a chess machine, must be allowed to have contact with human beings in order that it may adapt itself to their standards. Even in the context of chess, he's looking at it from a logical perspective. And, as it turns, the idea that, certainly for humans, chess involves a lot of modeling the other player's minds. Now, ultimately, that happened a lot less. The chess was beaten by Deep Blue through a lot of heuristics and explicit encoding of the social context of chess of, okay, this is how players might behave in such and such a scenario, but not any sort of holistic modeling of one's opponent or computer reasoning in an explicit way about the human practices in chess. But Turing does care about that, even in the context of chess. And this, I think, is the rationale behind Turing's original odd move, which is replacing the question of what is thinking with, can a computer imitate a man as well as a man can imitate a woman? The measure of AI is, in this phrasing, a measure of the human, not a measure of some abstract universal notion of intelligence. And I think Turing was very smart in making that observation, but it's also a huge can of worms. The Vienna Circle would not have liked it. They would have much rather have had a computer that could process pure logic and draw positivistic, firm conclusions, not one that has these that tries to do these airy processes of learning and engaging in social convention. But both these aspects are present in Turing's paper, and even while trying to replace the question of what is thinking, he himself gets torn between the brute logic of programming and the sheer ineffable weirdness of the human. So even Kant's transcendental categories start to seem a bit too specific and clear and transparent compared to what it is that Turing thinks a computer needs to do. And consequently, AI starts to look like a more humanistic discipline than most of philosophy even. And that's one hell of a paradox, that by moving away from the human, we actually come onto something that is actually more human, or that happens upon some of the greater difficulties of the human that philosophy tries to ignore. And that is where I wanted to leave off for this week. I would like to ask for questions and comments and thoughts. Perhaps what I'd like to start off with is I'd like to do a roundtable and just have everybody give their reactions to the Turing material and what they made of it, because this paper is now 70 years old. It's been incredibly important, and yet it's been received in misunderstood or vulgarized or just plainly wrong ways. So I guess what's the best way to do this? Does anyone have something to say about the Turing paper?
Yes.
Please say your name, just because it doesn't immediately flash.
This is Ekin. Yeah, I mean, I was last night reading this material, revisiting it, and I had just not quite, but a day ago, read this short letter to Turing by Giuseppe Longo. And Giuseppe Longo's research is about continuous computation versus discrete state machines, and continuity being so sort of through measurement, through mechanization, the discrete state machine exacts its scaffolding over continuity. And to see this, generative learning, adaptive, the vocabulary of some of adaptation being used in this in the Mathematical Society of London paper, it's very prescient. I mean, it's incredible foresight of what would be the characteristics of neural networks. Of a lot of the discourse today for AlphaGo and such has become inherent to the way we think about deep learning machines. Yeah, there is a bottleneck of Deep Blue, which is interesting to think about heuristic learning versus like truly generative. And that I sort of wanted to ask you, because there was one paper that made a qualification, and it was that the Garry Kasparov he loses to Deep Blue, and then there's this question of whether Deep Blue's evaluative functions, its use of book moves, its database and such, does this employ deep learning? And IBM says no. Long answer and short answer, no. It's computational power and simpler search and evaluation functions, or basically brute force methods. But it does use heuristic search, which is like a foundational machine learning technique. McCarthy and the Nielsen, this is mentioned too. So yeah, I mean, I don't really have any conclusion, just this is what I was thinking about.
No, yeah, I can speak to that. I as far as deep learning is defined, I would not say that Deep Blue qualifies, because simply because, yeah, it did have that explicit coding to such a great extent. And I think we have a good contrast for it because you now have AlphaGo 0. And effectively, you have been able to put those deep learning methods into play without needing that heuristic knowledge. That AlphaGo 0 in particular trained itself to play Go and Shogi based on the same underlying deep learning approaches. And I think that you point to that and it's like, okay, well, now that we've got enough processing power that we just throw it at the game and it can learn it without us needing to hard code all these things in order to beat Kasparov. And you've got something that is much more mysterious in the way that deep learning is. That while Deep Blue could be confusing, you know, people were able to open it up and say, oh, okay, it made that move because of such and such and such. And you can't really do that with a deep learning based approach. You know, AlphaGo 0 does what it does.
And that's creativity, you know, right?
Well, is it? Maybe, perhaps.
I mean, I guess so. Our creativity could human creativity be reduced to a functionalist mechanization? And if so, does that definition of creativity differ from what, you know, AlphaGo 0 we would qualify as creative move making?
Well, I think we'll have a lot of opportunities to answer that. I'm not going to speak to that right now because I think that's going to recur. Oh, functionalism, yes. So functionalism is the idea that it's basically the notion of a black box. It's basically the outside-in black box, that you're saying that, okay, that what defines the mind is not some sort of specific architecture or interior workings, but its ability to function in a certain way, that you give it certain inputs, it produces certain outputs. And if it meets your bar there, that's good enough. It follows on from behaviorism, but it's not purely related to behavior. You can operate it at any level. So you could say, well, you know, a mind has to behave in certain ways and also build up a certain, you know, internal storage of such and such or whatever. But it's just saying that you can't appeal to something like, well, it's not conscious or doesn't your hand wave that away.
One question, maybe also in regards to the definition of functionalism. I just know the term from sociological systems theory, and there it's pretty distinguished between effects, like just outputs of systems, and functions. That functions is something that a system needs to fulfill certain functions to stabilize and reproduce itself. And that this is something very different from just pure output effects. Is this connotation also like reproduction, stabilization, also in regards to AI?
No, it's broader than that. That can be part of the function, but it's not required. Now, if you want to say that the functional definition of thinking in the human requires that, then yes, the functionalist definition of thinking entails that. But functionalism is pretty open as far as you know, whatever functions you want to specify, if you meet them, that's good enough. You know, there doesn't have to be, there's no hidden requirements as far as logic goes. Would anyone else like to talk about anything in Turing that they found interesting?
Then would I just continue?
Oh,
if that's okay. Yeah, and I would like to connect the Turing piece and what we talked about with the questions I posed into the chat. And because they seem to be very distinct, but I think a red line of thought runs through them. The first one was like, could one maybe draw a parallel between computation and competition? And at first it was like, okay, these two words sound familiar, and this is just how I got to this idea, but it also related to what you the book you talked about, the master algorithm, that basically in the end, all paradigms of AI will merge into one. And the question of, like maybe the one reference I know about AI in regards to philosophy is like Nick Land's claim that capital is basically intelligence and the competition and the ability to win game. But yeah, this is like the only reference I have basically. And this also is, okay, is the brain the only thing that if AI is modeled on the brain, on a biological system, and then it seems to be implicitly said that the brain is the paradigmatic entity that that shows intelligent behavior, or that is intelligent. And I think that's one could at least question that, because maybe there's a implicit bias for us to say, okay, we have to identify a certain entity that's also spatiotemporal unified, that we say, we can point on it. This is the brain. It behaves intelligent. But maybe something like a much more abstract entity or mechanism maybe could also maybe show intelligent behavior, which we cannot just point towards and say, yeah, like capital isn't a thing one can point towards and say, hey, he is capital. And
right.
Yes, and this seems to connect very much to the imitation game of Turing and the Turing test, to imitate that the human is like from the beginning set at this paradigmatic model.
Right. Right. I mean, well, so yeah, there's a lot of interesting things there, which is, well, for a long time the human was the only game in town, and the question is, well, especially from the functionalist standpoint, you could say, well, if we move up from the level of the human, are the functionings of, say, global commerce, are the functionings of states, do these collective human entities qualify as intelligent? Are they collectively behaving intelligently? Is that intelligence something that we care about or that counts? And I think it's hard to avoid, but because people have had such a difficult time nailing it down in the first place, that we have enough trouble just with the individual, that that people have been hesitant, I think, to examine it on that level. Where they have looked at it is at the level of collective animal behavior, like ants and bees, because there you have these individual entities that are comparatively simple, and yet collectively act in ways that display seemingly a level of intent and intelligence that is clearly not present in the individual entities. And I think that's probably the most natural version of the argument you're making, which is, okay, well, can we construct a functional thinking mechanism out of anything? And there's another thought experiment, which I think is the nation of China example. I think this one might be Searle's as well, which is if everyone in China simulates part of a computer, and that simulated computer starts thinking or doing thinking behavior, does that count as thinking? And from the functionalist perspective, for a bunch of common specifications of that functioning, it does. So yeah, you can look at it on a variety of levels, and it also raises the issue of, okay, well, how do we recognize intelligence? Are there forms of intelligence that we may not even be able to recognize as intelligence, or is that a contradiction in terms, because the human is the measure of the intelligent and everybody else is just going to sort of, well, even if we don't fulfill our definition, we've got our definition, and it's based on an idealization of human behavior, and everybody is just falling short up against that.
maybe a problem would also arise if we make this super abstract notion of intelligence and discover intelligence in all kinds of systems. That one could say, okay, this intelligence loses its distinctiveness. We cannot really say anymore, okay, that is not intelligent behavior. And
Right.
then we may collapse into an idealism, like, okay, intelligence is in matter itself or in
Right.
nature
Right.
itself. And like,
Yeah.
yeah,
Oh, yeah.
if one makes the notion so broad that one cannot really distinguish it
Oh, yeah.
from the same like with classical philosophical notions of matter and idea. If everything is matter and one cannot distinguish matter from anything else, then you simply it's very dangerous to collapse into idealism. And
well, I think this is one of the
yeah.
I think this is one of the big reasons why panpsychism has actually returned, because I think the line of thinking you're going down, a lot of people haven't avoided it, but they've embraced it. They said, yeah, exactly. No kidding. You can't draw the line anywhere. So you're right. Yeah, a rock could think. And you know, I'd be lying if I'd said I hadn't contemplated and wasn't tempted by it myself, because it is, you do hit that wall. And luckily for us, we're not going to be considering that in this course, because it would explode it would explode the problems. But from the perspective of artificial intelligence, you're looking at, okay, well, when are we going to know when we've succeeded, and when are we going to know, and when are we going to understand the very metric that we're using to measure success? And you know, so if you've got 3 rocks that emerge into a complex system, you know, with gravity, is that already possibly something that could form into thought? Well, easier if you, I guess, if you say yes, but you still get down to the problems of emergence and exactly when something thinking is happening. But yeah, that's where I think primitive animals come in, and someone like Rodney Brooks has really, I think, said, okay, no, we want individual dumb robots that somehow coordinate, and complex behavior emerges. But getting that emergence is tricky. Anyone else have comments?
Well, I was thinking, like, regarding the Turing test, as it is, of just remembering kind of a funny experiment that took place, I guess, somewhere around the internet, but I'm somehow not able to Google it right now, but I guess I could, which consisted in somebody posting like a kind of a news in some channel that he and his friend has created chatbot, like AI-powered chatbot, and offered the users to try it out and actually kind of complete the Turing test and say if the bot was sentient, and like if he was talking to a machine or to a human. And so they did, and the like most of the participants answered that they were talking to a machine. But kind of the pretty stupid though catch was that it was like a chat between the users. So they were kind of trying to test the machine, pretty much getting to insulting each other pretty quickly, or I don't know, putting some random strings of text over there. Yeah, which is like pretty much interesting the way it is, like how does this functionalist paradigm could work here, and it is kind of context based. So we are kind of in this very changed context where we do not actually have this problem of facing an algorithm that would make sense, something like that.
Yeah, I think that excuse me. Damn it. I think that you again hit on the issue of exactly what social context you're putting things into, and the issue of, you know, the idea of generalized AI is, are we talking about generalized intelligence, whatever intelligence might be, or are we talking about generalized functioning in social practices as though those social practices are defined by what social practices humans engage in? And well, I mean, let's look at what we have today. Image labeling is what computers are doing, and one of the big complaints is, wow, they're reflecting computers' biases. And my friend Adam always says this. It's like, wow, people keep complaining that, you know, we need humans to correct computers' biases, and then they go around and complain that we need computers to correct humans' biases. It's like, well, yeah, there's a feedback loop here. But, you know, the process of labeling images with words, is that intelligent? Well, I think we can say that there's an intelligence involved when humans do it, but it's an intelligence that is wholly based in a bunch of linguistic and sociological practices that I am, in this picture, I am seeing it as a tree because the way I've been raised and the way I cope with reality is to see this particular set of visual stimuli as a tree. And I think the cyberneticists hit on that pretty strongly before the symbolic AI people just sort of throw that away and say, well, forget the picture. Let's just talk about the concept of a tree, you know, and go from there. We'll just portray everything in a logically symbolic way. And the extreme of that is, okay, what is thinking? Well, you know, for Descartes, if you take away memory, if you take away context, what's left is pure mathematics. What's left is, you know, the analytic a priori. All what you're doing is, all you can do in heaven is prove mathematical theorems over and over again. So the ultimate definition of thinking without the surrounding context is doing math and doing mathematical proofs. And mathematics has always been this limit case because it's one of these things that seems incredibly culturally abstracted. It's one of these things that you get, it doesn't seem to have a fixed practice aside beyond counting and things like that. And you get it evolving independently in identical ways. So there's something there that hints at this transhuman universality, maybe. Anyone else? Okay, well, I wanted to spend the last 10 minutes just doing logistical stuff. For next week, we're doing historical readings. And let me pull, where did the syllabus go? Here it is, I think. For next week, we're doing historical readings. And so what I want to focus on here is how, when AI came into prominence, what were the inputs of how people had thought about machines and the possibility of them thinking. And I picked an assortment of mostly philosophical readings, although Gulliver's Travels is in there too, that mostly talk about that very possibility of, okay, well, how could a computer act in some sort of human way? And there are varieties of how that's defined. And you have people like Leibniz, and to even greater extent than Leibniz, Hobbes, who really did want to mathematize the very idea of thinking, so that thinking was nothing more than computation. On the other hand, you know, you have someone like Swift, and to some extent Lovelace, that really tries to poke holes in this. And with Peirce, you finally get it moving into the realm of, okay, well, you know, how is learning and knowledge acquired through practical, pragmatic action? And so I think all these readings have something to say, and I guess what I'd like to do is to have you read them and then discuss them in the greater context of what this could mean for AI as we think of it now, as we experience it. And as far as the presentations for that go, what would be nice, I guess, is if 7 people in the class each speak for literally 2 or 3 minutes on each, well, let's say 5 minutes, whatever, on each of the 7 texts. I think that would be good, just because it would raise the question. So if all and so we have more than 7 people. How many enrollees do we have, Hernan?
We have, let me double check. I think it's 16.
6? Really? Holy moly. Okay, well, okay, well, so those who don't do it this time will get to do it subsequently. So I guess I would say, please, if you're interested in presenting next week, please send me by, I guess, ideally in a day or 2, a list of your top 3, in order of the top 3 prehistory papers that you would like to present on. And I guess send, I guess, whatever it is you're going to read out to the class, I guess prior to the session. Give it a day or 2 if you can. And I guess everybody else, read what was said and have some reflection on it. You aren't, I'm not going to require you to respond, but if you can come in with thoughts of, okay, well, this is what I think of such and such, that would be great.
David, we usually have the formal presentation that's like between 5-10 minutes each. We do like 1 or 2 presentations per session.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I know. I was hoping to divide it up into shorter ones, but perhaps that's unmanageable. Maybe. All right. How about this? Let's do what I said, but I'll only pick 2 or 3 instead of doing all 7. And I would say, I don't think we need to do the Raymond Yoy, but I think all the others are worth. So apart from the Yoy, if you're interested in presenting, tell me your top 2, I guess, of the remaining 6, and I'll pick people and say, okay, here are the 2 or 3 people who are going to present. Okay.
I wanted to ask, because you said we should send the class material we want to present before the session, or what exactly should we send? Or did I misunderstood anything?
Yeah, ideally, I just send a brief overview of your thoughts. It just has to be a paragraph or 2, just to give an idea of what you'll be saying in the presentation, so that people can think of a response prior to the class as well as during the presentation.
Okay, thanks. And the assignments just every time for the next week and not now for the rest of the course.
Sorry?
And the assignments always just at the always just for the next week and not now for the entirety of the course.
Yeah, we may change it up depending on how it goes.
Okay.
Especially once we get to the more technical material, we may have to change pace depending on sort of how that goes over. But for this historical material, I think this will work.
Okay.
Please, if you have any questions, please email me. And otherwise, Hernan, is there anything else that needs to be worked out?
I don't think so. Just general information. We're not having a class on the 21st and the 28th of December.
Right.
Reconvening.
So we are meeting next week, but then we'll have 2 weeks off.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Okay, and where did Zoom go? There it is. All right, any final questions? Oh, one response. It's one response per presentation. I misunderstood. Okay. How do we pick the responders then?
I mean, everybody can select one text to respond as well, or like 3 choices of response for the text. I mean, that would work as well. I think we can sort it out. I can help you.
Okay. 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 If one response per presentation. Okay. Well, I guess if each person talks. Okay. Why doesn't everybody pick the top 3 to present and the top 3 to respond to? I'm not sure. I'm not. That sounds great. Okay. Yeah. Everybody. So we'll do, I guess, 2 or 3 sets of presentations and responses. That sounds great. Okay. Any questions?
If we're interested in presenting on something, topic 5 or topic 4, wait until the week before that topic to email you about that, I assume, so as to not inundate you.
I think so. We might go a bit ahead next week, but for this week, I'd just like to carve out next week's, just because I want us to have a clearer idea. I'd like everybody to get a clearer idea of the material before they start picking them. So I wanted to wait a week before we pick out stuff from the later subjects.
One last question. Are we going to have a Facebook group chat?
Oh, I'm happy to do. Yep.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't realize that was something that was done. So yeah.
As far as I know, in every class I was this.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Okay. So yeah, this is the first time I've taught at New Center. So I somehow I either missed that or I wasn't told. So who sets up the Facebook group?
Razvan did. It's actually up.
Oh, okay. Well, let me get on that. Okay. Okay. I will see you all there then. And I guess if there's short announcements, everybody's capable of getting on Facebook. All right, let's go on Facebook. Okay, if there's anyone who doesn't want to use Facebook, I get it. So email me and we'll figure something out. We're not going to use MeWe though. All right. I think our time is up. Hernan,
I made an account on that website, but it doesn't. It seems like another LO.
That probably. I think that's the whole thing. You never know, like what's going to be what's going to hit it big. So I made an account too. I was like, might as well grab my name just in case this happens to be the Facebook killer. But yeah, it's probably going to be a lot.
Yeah.
Okay. Great to meet you all. Thanks for joining us. Looking forward to it. I hope you. If you don't get your questions answered, I hope you get more questions. And I'll see you all next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Till next week.
Bye-bye.